Up to the other slide. Good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon for everybody on the East Coast. For some folks, it might be still morning. We will get started with the HoUSed call for universal, stable, affordable housing in just a minute. We'll give people a moment to log in and we'll be right back to you. Thank you. People are still logging into the call here, so we're going to give it one more 15 seconds more and we'll be right back to you. Okay, welcome everyone to this week's National House Campaign call for universal, stable, affordable housing. I'm Paul Keeley. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Really appreciate you joining us today for this call. It's been a couple weeks since we've done it because we've shifted to a new schedule where this call happens every other week on Mondays. And then the intervening weeks, we held webinars related to our Homes, Our Votes, nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement project. And actually, we'll hear a little bit more about that in our call today. Again, I'm Paul Keeley, the COO. I just want to say we've got a really great call lined up for today. We're going to hear from Sarah Sadian on our team about updates on the reconciliation bill and the fiscal year 23 budget process and discuss how advocates can engage their members of Congress to urge them support for robust housing investments in both. We'll also be joined by some colleagues at the Department of the Treasury to talk about the latest on emergency rental assistance spending numbers and the process that has been put in place for recapturing and reallocating emergency rental assistance. David Greenberg from Local Initiative Support Corporation will share a new report on the impact of multifamily housing speculation and its effects on low income and BIPOC tenants. NLIC's Courtney Cooperman will provide updates on Our Homes, Our Votes, as I mentioned earlier, the nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement project. We'll hear from one of the cohort members of NLIC's End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions project. We'll get updates from the field and more. I do want to just remind everybody and tell people for the first time, if this is your first time joining one of these calls, that we will share out all of the PowerPoints that are shown during this call. We will also send out a recording of the call and a recap of the call. So sometimes we get questions about that. Just know that we will send all of that out to everybody who has signed up and is participating in today's call. We will have time in most of the, in all of the presentations, panels, and so forth that we have. We will have time for questions and answers. I do encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of any of our presenters. I'll generally refer to that. Certainly feel free to use the chat as well, just to communicate with each other. But I'll generally focus mainly on the Q&A for questions for our presenters. We may not be able to get to all of the questions asked, and if they have time, if we don't get to all of them, our panelists will try to answer any remaining questions through the chat. So we will go ahead and get started now, and I will turn it over to my colleague here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Sarah Sadian, Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Field Organizing, to talk a little bit about the reconciliation bill and the FY23 budget request. So Sarah, take it away.
Great, thanks so much for having me. It's good to be with you all. I'm going to start with the budget reconciliation bill because we're starting to see signs of life after 4 months of Congress really just putting this on the back burner. There are new reports out that the White House is looking to restart negotiations with Senator Manchin, with other congressional Democrats in the coming weeks. We have heard that this is likely to be their last attempt to try to get something across the finish line before the midterm elections. So we're coming upon a really important time to see whether or not congressional Democrats can reach a deal and what will be included. You may remember, we talked about this before, but Senator Manchin has signaled that he's open to restarting conversations. He put out his own framework for an agreement that includes both raising taxes on high income earners and corporations, generating some savings through negotiated drug prices, and then splitting that money between deficit reduction and other spending priorities like climate change, healthcare, and other ways to reduce costs for households. There's a lot of uncertainty about what is included and how big the overall package is. We've read that the White House is being very quiet this time around. They don't want the press and outside sources to put too much pressure on them. They want to be able to get a deal when they can. But this is a really important time for advocates to be weighing in with their members of Congress. We know that the focus of any budget reconciliation bill will include addressing inflation and addressing costs for households. And since the skyrocketing rents that many of us are seeing in our communities, that is one of the primary drivers of inflation. We still think that there's a really strong argument to make for why targeted housing investments like rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund are really needed and should be included in any bill going forward. I also spoke with a member of the Progressive Caucus last week who agreed that they still think that there's a path forward for housing money to make it into a budget reconciliation bill, but they admitted that it's going to take a lot of hard work from advocates to be loud and consistent in engaging with their members of Congress over the next couple of weeks. Of course, all of that said, this is still a very fragile situation. Just because Senator Manchin might agree to a framework doesn't mean that other senators would, like, for example, Senator Sinema from Arizona, who has raised concerns about tax increases before. Any budget reconciliation bill that moves forward is going to have to be supported by every single Democrat in the Senate and nearly all Democrats in the House. And so if you have a Democratic senator or representative, you have a really important role to play here to make sure, one, that housing remains in the bill and that something gets across the finish line. We know that in terms of a time frame for when they're trying to get something done, there are reports that they want to have an agreement about a framework of more specifics about what would be included, maybe by June, if not sooner. I've also heard that Memorial Day is a key date that they're looking at, and that the risk is that if they don't get something done or they don't reach a deal by mid-July, it means that it probably won't happen anytime before the midterms for them to get that done, because they would need to be able to draft the bill and vote on it before they leave for August recess. So we have a really short window of time here between now and maybe Memorial Day, maybe now and June, where we'll see whether or not Democrats can pick up this ball and carry it across the finish line. And it also means we have a short window of time to make sure that housing investments are included in any final bill. So please, I encourage you to reach out to your members of Congress. They are home for recess this week and next week. They're going to be hosting events and town halls. So this is a perfect time for you to attend those or to ask for meetings in person so that you can be asking them about their support for housing investments in a final package. I also wanted to talk a little bit about appropriations. So I'm going to share in the chat box a link to our analysis of the president's budget, which was released in late March and included very significant funding increases for HUD programs. One of those increases I just want to call out would be a expansion of the housing choice voucher program to an additional 200,000 households. If that were to be enacted in the spending bill, that would be the most significant expansion of the program since it was created, and would be a really important step forward towards our collective goal, which is universal housing assistance. So really important that they included that in the president's budget request. There was also calls for more funding for public housing, for homeless assistance grants, and other key programs. Now that the president's request is out, though, that means that both the House and Senate can start their processes for drafting bills and voting on their spending bills. And one of the very first steps in that process is getting feedback from senators and representatives about what they want to see in the FY23 spending bill. And so House members will have until April 29th to submit their priorities to the House Appropriations Committee. Senators have until May 13th to do that through the Senate committee. And so this is a really important time for advocates to be weighing in with their members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, and asking them to support the highest level of funding possible for housing programs. This year, in addition to pushing for overall more funding for housing, the National Income Housing Coalition is prioritizing 5 main programs that we think need to have extra focus and attention by Congress in the spending bill. I'm going to put that in the chat box too, because I'm sure you all will all ask me for it. There's a lot of words there, but we're really focused on 5 key parts of FY23. One is, like I mentioned, expanding housing choice vouchers to 200,000 more households. But we also want to see really robust funding for homeless assistance grants, for public housing, for legal assistance, and for tribal housing dollars. And we picked those programs because they are the most targeted to where the needs are the greatest and for people who have the very lowest incomes. It's not to say we don't support other programs, we do. We're going to continue to push for as much funding as possible for all housing programs, but we just wanted to call out these specific ones as well. Since congressional offices tend to have deadlines that happen before the committee deadlines, the sooner you reach out to your members of Congress, the better. And then once those deadlines expire, we'll start to see those appropriations committees holding hearings, putting together bill text, and voting on their bills. We'll probably see subcommittees start to vote on their draft spending bills around June or July. But I will say that we are not expecting Congress to pass a final FY23 spending bill before the midterms. The new fiscal year starts on October 1, and I think that it will be likely that Congress will need a continuing resolution or a CR that will keep the government open while negotiations are continuing to happen. So typically we've seen CRs that might take us through November or December. There's a good chance, a possibility that we could see a continuing resolution or a series of them that push us into the new year. That could very well be the case, especially if Republicans take over the House and Senate or Senate, because you can imagine if a new party takes control, they'll want to have some say over what the budget looks like. And so we've sometimes seen in the past, after elections, Congress will have a continuing resolution into the new year and allow that new Congress to make decisions about funding levels. So there are a couple of things that you can do to help support, to make sure that housing programs are getting the highest level of funding possible. I mentioned before that you could reach out to your members of Congress and ask them to weigh in through the appropriations process. Again, I'll just share those deadlines. For the House was April 29th, for the Senate was May 13th. The second thing that you can do is sign on to our sign-on letter. I just included a link to it in the chat box. This is the letter that urges Congress to fund housing programs, homelessness programs, community development programs at the highest level possible. We have about 900 organizations signed on to that letter so far, but we need a lot more. So after you sign on, share it with the other organizations that you work with and help us get a really robust showing for this. And with that, I will turn it back to Paul.
Great, Sarah. There is one question that came in. What is NLIHC's take on the reduction in funding for sections 202 and 811? And maybe you could just explain to people who don't know what section 202 and 811 are.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Section 202 program is a program that builds housing specifically for low-income seniors. The 811 program is a program that builds housing specifically for people with disabilities. Those are two programs that did not get higher funding levels in the president's budget request. Sort of outliers in that way. Most programs received higher funding. But when we spoke with HUD staff, they made it clear that a lot of that had to do with the fact that those programs got higher funding than maybe anticipated in FY22 in last year's budget, which was only passed in the beginning of March. And so the administration had spent the last several months putting together this budget request and just didn't know where those final spending numbers would come out for those programs. So I don't really take the cuts in funding in the budget request to be indicative of anything other than the fact that there was just not good timing when it came to passing the earlier bill. So I don't think it's a signal that the administration doesn't support those programs. I think it's just a function of the fact that it takes many, many, many months to put together a budget request. And they had to start that process and continue that process when the FY22 spending bill wasn't finished yet. So it was a little hard for them to anticipate how much funding would be provided or needed.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't see any other questions specifically to what you are addressing. So I think that we'll move on in our agenda. Thank you very much for that information.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, we will now move on to a couple of friends from the U.S. Department of the Treasury, Vikram Viswanathan, Senior Advisor on Emergency Housing Programs there, and also Jacob Liebenluft, Chief Office of Recovery Programs at the Department of Treasury. And they're going to talk to us a little bit about the emergency rental assistance spending and ERA, as we call it, ERA 2 reallocation. So I will turn it over to you gentlemen, and whoever's going to go first, you guys can fight over it.
Thanks so much, Paul. And thank you, everyone, for having us here today. My name is Jacob Liebenluft. I am the Chief Recovery Officer at Treasury, which means I oversee the office that leads our various relief and recovery efforts, including emergency rental assistance. I want to thank this group, and this is, I think, my second time addressing NLIHC in the last month, just for all the work you are doing to advocate for the most vulnerable tenants across the country. I know that NLIHC and so many on this call have been crucial to the effort to get rental assistance out the door and prevent what could have been a devastating wave of evictions as a result of the pandemic and the economic crisis it caused. Your work is reflected in what we see in the numbers around the ERA program. And to kick off our brief presentation, I wanted to start with a few words about where the program stands, in particular because it provides some important context for the reallocation guidance we recently released, which my colleague Vikram will provide some additional details on in a moment. Treasury recently announced that $30 billion in emergency rental assistance funds have been either spent or obligated to households, with over 4.7 million payments going to households. What that means is two things. First of all, assistance has been going to those who need it. Per Treasury data, 80% of those households are very low income. And according to a recent Eviction Lab analysis, these funds have helped keep eviction filings well below pre-pandemic levels last year, with the greatest impacts in communities of color. Second, it means that money is quickly running short. We now expect that the vast majority of remaining funds will be obligated to households or paid to grantees in the coming months, and thus unable to be used for reallocation. As you know, given the lack of infrastructure that existed for rental assistance when Congress created the program, as well as the initial guidance for the program that was established at the end of the previous administration, the statistics I just shared reflect some significant progress, supported both by the policies underpinning the program and the hard work that has been done by program administrators and their partners across the country. From the first weeks of the Biden-Harris administration, the Treasury Department under Secretary Yellen has acted decisively to increase flexibility within the program, including by enabling grantees to avoid burdensome documentation requirements through the use of self-attestation, as well as encouraging improvements to language access, streamlined payments, partnerships with courts, rehousing initiatives, and the documentation of promising practices. Our work has also been buttressed by our approach to reallocation, beginning with our implementation of ERA-1 reallocation, through which Treasury has so far reallocated more than $2 billion over 2 rounds, with a final round taking place shortly. Our goal in this reallocation has been to ensure that as many low-income renters as possible receive emergency assistance. What we've done has allowed the large majority of reallocated funds to be transferred voluntarily between grantees within the same state. And we've also worked hard to encourage grantees at risk of reallocation to participate in this process. However, even in cases of involuntary reallocation, Treasury has first looked to reallocate to an in-state grantee, while also making funds available to other jurisdictions that have been fastest in spending out their funds. Our ERA-2 guidance implements similar principles, but it also acknowledges the reality that these emergency funds will soon run out, and that there is a dire need for states, localities, and tribal governments to make long-term durable investments in assisting tenants and promoting housing stability. Treasury has consistently urged grantees to use a portion of the $350 billion in state and local fiscal recovery funds, as well as other funds, to supplement their ERA allocations and build on the infrastructure that ERA has created to address outstanding need in their communities. And Treasury's new reallocation guidance for ERA-2 has been structured to incentivize this spending. This builds on some activity we already see. According to our latest reporting data, state, local, and tribal governments have budgeted over $3.75 billion for rent, mortgage, and utility assistance, as well as eviction prevention services through the end of 2021 under the state and local fiscal recovery funds, with billions more for other housing initiatives like affordable housing development. For example, New Jersey has committed $790 million of their state and local funds for additional rental and utility assistance, while Washington State budgeted $400 million for emergency rental assistance, and St. Louis County is putting $5 million towards supplementing its emergency rental assistance program. And looking to the longer term, Treasury is also encouraging grantees to invest in a wide range of housing stability services and eviction prevention initiatives, including the right to counsel, court-based eviction diversion, and a range of other effective structures we have seen deployed across the country, as well as critically to expand affordable housing supply. Making these key investments with funds that will be available after the ERA programs run out, not just state and local fiscal recovery funds, but also other sources of state and local spending, will help to ensure that we fully utilize and further expand upon the nationwide infrastructure that we have built to create lasting change for renters and families in need. So now I'll turn it over to Vikram, who is a senior advisor on our emergency housing team, to provide some additional details about our ERA-2 reallocation process before we take some questions.
Great, thanks for that, Jacob. Hi, everyone. I'm Vikram Viswanathan. I'm a senior advisor with the Emergency Housing Programs. And just like Jacob said, I wanted to thank all of you at NLIHC and the broader group of housing stakeholders for all your work with us over the course of this program so far. As Jacob mentioned, I'm going to go a little bit into the mechanics of reallocation. And so some of this does get a little bit detailed, but I do know that that's where we've gotten a lot of questions recently. Happy to answer them, and then also do some Q&A to get into further details. I'll touch briefly on ERA 1, as I know some questions have come up for that, and that's the reallocation that has already been in place. We did a round of reallocation based on September data and on November data. We are now approaching the final round of reallocation for ERA 1. So there will not be a round based on January data. Instead, based on data as of March 31st, we will let grantees keep unobligated funds up to the highest quarterly amount of expenditures that they've had. And the broader principle behind this is to make sure funds are used by the statutory deadline, give other grantees enough time to use funds that are received through reallocation, and recognize that even grantees at varying levels of performance still have need and ability to use those funds. And so that's where we set this balance between looking at unobligated funds and allowing grantees to keep up to the highest quarterly amount of expenditure. For tribes, that will happen a quarter later, so we will not be recapturing funds from tribes until after Q2. But for states, localities, and territories, this will be based on Q1 data. After all this, that would be the final round based on the initial allocations, but we may look at funds received through reallocation later in the year, again, with the purpose of making sure that funds are used by the statutory deadline. So that's a brief bit on ERA 1. I want to spend most of this time on ERA 2, getting into the mechanics of some of what Jacob laid out. As I talk through this, you'll see a lot of it is structurally similar to ERA 1 reallocation, and I'll highlight some of the similarities and differences. First is how we think about expenditure ratios. So just like with ERA 1, there is a cadence of escalating expenditure ratios over time. And so over the course of this year, we're going to be looking at ERA 2 expenditure ratios based on Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4 data. And so the ratios will escalate from 20% based on Q1 data to 40% based on Q2 to 60% based on Q3, and then potentially all funds potentially subject to reallocation at the end of the year. Now, behind that is a methodology for calculating that expenditure ratio. In ERA 1, we held the admin allocation aside, and so we were essentially looking at grantees' progress on expenditure relative to the funds available for assistance. Similarly for ERA 2, for the first and second quarter, we are going to be removing the 15% admin allocation and the 10% housing stability allocation from that calculation. And so that gives grantees time to obligate those funds. For Q3 and Q4, we'll still hold the 15% admin allocation aside, but housing stability will be part of the calculation. And so that sets the denominator that we're measuring expenditures against over the course of the year. Another similarity with ERA 1 is the opportunity for mitigation. So just like with ERA 1 in the first assessment, we gave grantees time to catch up, recognizing that there were grantees that were accelerating at different stages. And so for ERA 2, even with this first 20% expenditure ratio threshold based on March data, we are giving grantees until the end of April to catch up to that number. If they do catch up, then they are mitigated for round 1. If they don't, then they are subject to excess funds based on their March data. And another option is that grantees who voluntarily reallocated at least 25% of their ERA 1 funds are also mitigated in this first round of ERA 2 reallocation. And that's recognizing that many grantees were proactive about shifting funds where they were needed most in ERA 1 and are now turning to their ERA 2 funds. That's been more focused on the recapture process. I'll talk a little bit more about requesting reallocated funds. According to the statute, grantees need to have obligated 50% of their initial allocation to be eligible to receive reallocated funds, and that's different from 65% in ERA 1. Similarly to ERA 1, we will be prioritizing in state first, and we will be looking at progress on ERA spending to prioritize where reallocated funds are most likely to be deployed. Similarly to ERA 1, we'll also be allowing for voluntary reallocation from the grantees remaining 60% of their allocation after they draw down the first 40%. So I've talked a bit about structurally what is similar between ERA 1 and ERA 2, as well as where some of the numbers and details are different. I'll highlight a few of the biggest substantive differences with ERA 2 reallocation. So one of the biggest ones is that according to the statute, ERA 2 reallocation happens out of funds that have not yet been paid to the grantee. So while in ERA 1, Treasury issued recapture letters and could recapture funds that had already been paid to grantees, bring them back into Treasury, and send them out to other grantees through a reallocation process. In ERA 2, that will be funds that have not yet been paid out to those grantees. Another difference is that in prioritizing grantees for receiving funds, we are also going to be looking at how grantees have used non-ERA funds for rental assistance. And as Jacob mentioned, we're encouraging the use of state and local funds, as well as other budgetary options available to supplement the infrastructure that ERA funds have helped build. And so we're going to be releasing more details in the coming weeks about how that's going to be incorporated into the request for reallocated funds, but that's one of the biggest distinctions, that we will prioritize grantees who have made use of those other funds, starting with the Q2 round. And the last piece is that based on the statute, we cannot reallocate the first 40% that has been allocated to a state, but we will be releasing more details in the coming weeks about how we address the remaining 60%. And that is one important part of our guidance, is that when the 40% has not been drawn down yet, we are able to reallocate the remaining 60% from that allocation. One piece that's connected to this, and it's not directly about reallocation, but I know the question has come up, is about how grantees draw down their different payment tranches for ERA 2. We've set this up to allow for grantees to draw this down in 3 tranches. First, their initial 40% payment, and then they can draw down half of what's left, and then finally they can come and draw down the remainder. And the reason we've done that is to balance the need for grantees to draw down funds as they need them, but also recognizing that the funds that remain are what can be reallocated. And so we need to balance those needs and make sure that grantees are getting access to those funds at the time where they're ready to use them. And according to the statute, grantees have to have obligated 75% of funds received so far before they can draw down the next tranche. And so that's an example of where the payment process is closely related to reallocation in terms of the philosophy and principles behind all of this. Now, that's a lot of detail. The big picture, as Jacob said, is the overall goal here is to make sure that we are moving funds where they can be used most effectively and efficiently, recognizing the need across the country. And I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A, and so Jacob and I are happy to get into any questions there.
Great, thank you, Jacob and Vikram. That's really valuable information. There are a couple of questions. We'll see if we can answer at least a couple of them here. One from Nathan says, if a state is declining its reallocation of funding, so I guess more funds are being offered to the state, but they decline it, will their ERA 1 funds be recaptured?
So Vikram, you should add in here. I want to make sure I understand the question. So I'm gonna do my best here. And obviously if there's something we're missing, we're happy to follow up. So, I mean, the reallocation process under ERA 1, requires that a jurisdiction come in for funds that they would like and can use based on their past performance. So you shouldn't have reallocation going to a jurisdiction that has not requested funds. So I think this may not be an issue, but I may be misunderstanding Vikram. I'm curious if you have anything to add here.
Yeah, my understanding based on of the question, so for ERA 1, if a grantee is receiving reallocated funds, that means they have requested it and have proven themselves eligible. If the question is actually about ERA 2 and a circumstance where a state is not drawing down the initial 40%, that is where we can reallocate the remaining 60% of the allocation, but that's for ERA2, not for ERA1.
Great. There's a question here. What impact will the PIP reports submitted in April have on ERA1 reallocation?
I can jump in on there. So the program improvement plans were initially a mitigant in ERA1 for the first round of reallocation. And so they allowed grantees who might have been subject to a 30% expenditure ratio threshold to instead be evaluated against a 15% threshold. That's where they had an impact on reallocation. The progress reports now due in April, or a bit of a rolling schedule depending on when those plans were approved, are meant to review the progress. And so they aren't direct inputs into reallocation, but they do help us understand as part of our grantee relationships where grantees have been improving and where they've been facing struggles. And so that's how they come into play here.
Great. There's a question here. I think maybe you answered this, but let me just share it with you and see what you think. There is a difference, as you point out, that between funds obligated and funds paid out to households. It can take months for obligated ERA funds to reach households in needs. And the question is, how will Treasury ensure that those obligated funds are distributed quickly before tenants are behind on rent and face eviction?
I'll start here, but Vikram should add details. I think this is an important question, and we've been focused since the beginning of the program on ensuring that grantees are not only identifying renters in need, but actually making payments so that they can stay in their homes. Our tools here can at times be limited because, for example, funds that are obligated to household can't be recaptured by Treasury. But I do think there's a key piece of our guidance, and it's that I want to highlight, which is that the expenditure ratios that Vikram mentioned that determine whether or not a grantee is subject to recapture under either ERA1 or ERA2, those are expenditure ratios. They refer to the amount that has actually been spent. So that creates a really important incentive in our process for grantees to ensure that they're not simply obligating, that they are also making those payments themselves. So that is one tool we've included, of course, in addition to the technical assistance that we focused on in working with grantees to try to ensure that payments get out faster. But Vikram, anything you want to add to that?
Absolutely. I think Jacob captured it. Obligations and expenditures are both really important metrics for progress in this program. And that's why obligations come into play in terms of eligibility to draw down additional tranches, as well as eligibility to receive reallocated funds. But when we're really looking at progress in terms of where funds are reallocated from, expenditures are usually the critical metric. And that's because, exactly as the question pointed out, it's so important to convert those obligations into expenditures to actually reach the people in need.
All right, fantastic. There are a lot of questions. You guys were very popular here. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. There is a question here that I'm also interested in knowing about is, will Treasury be releasing the PIP progress reports publicly?
That's a great question. We haven't determined that yet, and that's partly because there have been some kind of revisions and back and forth with certain grantees, but that's something we can provide an update on later.
Okay, fantastic. If you guys have a few more minutes, there are other questions that have come into the Q&A, and you can select, answer, and you can type your answer to those questions if you have time. We'd really appreciate it. I think we do need to move on in our agenda and make sure we have enough time for all of our speakers today. Jacob and Vikram, thank you so much for sharing this really valuable information. Thanks again.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care. Okay, we are now turning to a colleague from Local Initiative Support Corporation, David Greenberg, who's VP of Knowledge Management and Research there, to talk about a new report on the impact of multifamily housing speculation on low-income and BIPOC communities. So David, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, take it away.
Thanks so much. Kim, if you're, yeah, thanks so much. So thanks very much to the Coalition for the opportunity to present this recently published research which we really feel affirms what many tenants and their advocates have been experiencing about the harm caused by housing speculation and financialization, but also the protective power of affordable housing investments. So I'm just going to present a very quick overview of findings, but you can find both the full analyses and a summary report on the LISC website, or please do reach out to report authors. Up front, I want to acknowledge the paper's co-authors, but especially recognize how the project builds on the groundbreaking work of our collaborators at the University Neighborhood Housing Program in the Bronx, who, as part of the general leadership in New York City, analyzing the connection between housing finance and housing justice, have since the early 2000s maintained a database of the sale prices and debt that's been associated with privately held apartment buildings of 5 or greater units throughout New York City. And they linked these data, among other things, to housing maintenance violations reported by the city. If you could advance one slide, please. So as I don't need to tell folks on the call, part of the urgency of this piece is obviously the confluence of rising risks of evictions, and also market actors and forces who are mobilizing to profit from tenant crises. And though the research uses NYC as a case study, lest you think it's only a New York story, as people on this call well know, rents are substantially up all around the country. Eviction filings increased dramatically since the Supreme Court overturned the CDC eviction moratorium, and predatory investors are operating in settings ranging from manufactured housing to single-family rentals. So in order to address some of the root causes of the ongoing housing crisis, we feel it's critical to understand both tenant experiences and the market forces that drive evictions and poor housing quality, and that's what this research explores. If you could advance, please. So we built on UNHP's longitudinal database to create a quantitative measure of how quickly an apartment building rose in sales price, and also how much additional debt it took on when an owner refinanced. As people on this call know, refinancing mortgages to take on more debt that's generally cheap, and then using that money for more profitable investments has become a very important way that speculators realize profits. We then use that measure of speculation to ask questions about where the greatest returns have been realized for investors, the consequences of speculation to tenants in terms of housing quality and eviction rates, and finally, building on a database of subsidized housing from NYU's Furman Center, we explore the impact of those investments in promoting positive outcomes for tenants. Next slide, please. So our first finding, which again, unsurprising for many on the call, is that speculation was statistically more likely to occur in lower income Black and Latinx neighborhoods seeing signs of gentrification than it was in whiter wealthy areas. In other words, the greatest returns on investments in the multifamily market from 2003 to 2020 were realized not in ultra wealthy areas of Manhattan, but places like the Bronx, where the child poverty rate is about 40%. Next slide, please. So second, extracting these profits from buildings demonstrably harmed tenants who lived there. So buildings that appreciated the quickest, which in our research was a threshold of about a 30% annual increase in sales price, or about a 50% annual increase in debt, had up to 2.7 times the number of maintenance violations, and also successfully evicted their tenants at 1.5 times the rate of similar buildings in similar neighborhoods. And as everyone knows, completed Marshall's evictions are not the only way that displacement occurs. Next slide, please. So unsurprisingly, these are New York City neighborhoods that advocates have been drawing attention to for some time. They've been hit hardest by what's been called predatory equity, by evictions, and also by COVID death rates. Could you advance, please? So finally, on a more positive note, affordable housing, despite the stereotype of being poorly maintained, had fewer maintenance violations on a whole than unsubsidized units in our data. And that even includes luxury housing and new construction. up to 3/4 fewer violations in some places, depending on the year. They were also less likely to be acquired at higher values or take on higher debt levels in properties in similar neighborhoods, which means that they were removed from the speculative market while the subsidy is in place. And just to note that the database was privately held housing, so it didn't include the New York City Housing Authority. Next slide, please. So based on these analyses, the report authors make some recommendations related to tenant protections, resources to acquire housing into community and nonprofit ownership, recommendations about code enforcement, taxation to curb speculation, and lending related regulatory policy. But really stepping back, the primary finding that speculation leads to evictions. Again, it's not news to people on this call, but I think what we're trying to say is that even as we really need to center the needs of tenants and BIPOC communities in the looming potential eviction crisis, we want to draw attention to the fact that those who have profited the most in the recent housing market have also done the most harm. And also to the fact that the solutions that advocates have been proposing have resulted in better outcomes for tenants and communities. And with that, I can take some questions if there's time.
Great. Thank you very much, David. And thank you for sharing that report with us. There is a question here from Carrie Hill. Do you have any maps that overlay with opportunity zones? And is there any indication that opportunity zones are fueling what you're describing here?
We haven't done that overlay, but we can do that as a follow-up analysis, and we're interested in an advocate's recommendations about where to turn next.
Great. There is another question about how you get access to debt figures like this that you're analyzing.
Yeah, so our partners at UNHP use a city database called ACRIS, which records both sales price and mortgages on properties. And when there's an adjustment, that's the basis of our analysis about rising debt.
All right, very good. David, I think that's it in terms of questions. There may be others that come in. If you want to just keep an eye out on the chat and the Q&A box, that would be great. Really appreciate you coming on the call today to share this very important report.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks. All right, we will now move on to our own Courtney Cooperman, who is a housing advocacy organizer at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. He's going to give an update on our Homes, Our Votes nonprofit candidate and voter engagement project, nonpartisan candidate and voter engagement project. So Courtney, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Paul. My name is Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer at NLIHC. Our Homes, Our Votes is NLIHC's nonpartisan campaign to increase voter participation among low-income renters and to educate candidates about housing solutions. It's no coincidence that the lowest income renters that face the greatest obstacles to housing stability also face the greatest barriers to voting. Our Homes, Our Votes aims to break the cycle of disenfranchisement of low-income renters by providing the tools that housing advocates need to increase voter turnout and elevate affordable housing as an election issue. Last Monday, Our Homes, Our Votes hosted our 2022 kickoff webinar, and thank you to the many people on this call today who joined us last week. NLIHC's Diane Yantel spoke about the campaign's successful efforts in 2020, which played a major role in inspiring presidential candidates to develop strong affordable housing plans and talk about housing on the campaign trail. Dr. Bambi Hayes Brown of Georgia ACT spoke about their transformative work to mobilize voters and engage with candidates in Georgia. NLIHC's Jen Butler shared the campaign's communication strategy from 2020 and what to expect going forward. And Jillian Slee of Eviction Lab presented new research on the connection between increasing eviction rates and declining voter turnout. And we featured a special message from Representative Chuy Garcia of Illinois on the Our Homes, Our Votes Act, a bill that would facilitate voter registration for residents of federally subsidized housing. And you can find the link to the recording of the kickoff webinar in the chat. The Our Homes, Our Votes webinars will continue in rotation with this HoUSed national call every other Monday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. Next week's webinar, Getting Started on Election Work, will walk through every aspect of a strong voter and candidate engagement campaign, encompassing voter registration, voter education, get out the vote, candidate engagement, and ballot measure advocacy. Caitlin Donnelly, who's a senior program director at Nonprofit Vote, will provide tips for organizations to assess their capacity, build partnerships, set goals, and secure funding that will enable them to carry out their plans effectively. And Abby Eng from NLIHC state partner Tenants and Neighbors in New York will talk about their own planning process as a model that you can use to launch your voter and candidate engagement work. And you can find the registration link for the webinar in the chat. Finally, as you may have seen in your inbox last week, if you're on the NLIHC email list, Our Homes, Our Votes has launched our bi-weekly newsletter that features the latest national news, research, updates from our partners on the ground, events, and other resources about voting as it relates to housing advocacy. You can stay tuned for the next edition of the newsletter later this month. And finally, to keep up with the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign, you can follow us on Twitter at Our Homes Votes and like us on Facebook at OHOV 2022. Feel free to reach out to ourhomes@nlihc.org or to me directly if you have any questions or want to get more involved with the campaign. And I hope to see you all on the webinar next Monday.
Great, thank you, Courtney. So really just we do encourage all nonprofits involved in affordable housing to become involved in nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement through Our Homes, Our Votes. The website is chock full of great resources that you can pull off of there and use. It's just a really phenomenal project that we're involved in. So we want to encourage everybody to join in this effort. We have a note here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We'll be hosting Our Homes, Our Votes Meet the Candidates on April 19th, a great example of this kind of work. Courtney, could you just say a word about the Our Homes, Our Votes Act? How would that work in terms of engaging renters in the voting process?
Yes, the Our Homes, Our Votes Act would add certain types of federally subsidized housing to the motor voter law, which basically is a way that facilitates voter registration when people interact with government agencies like the DMV, but it doesn't currently include like PHAs or federally subsidized housing providers. So it would be integrating voter registration so that when renters are interacting with that process, they also have the opportunity to register to vote. And I can drop the link. We have you can write a letter to your member of Congress on that bill. I can drop that in the chat as well.
Great, thank you. Courtney, there is a question, is there funding available for this kind of work through NLIHC? And I'll answer that one. We had very minimal, limited resources that we were able to provide to a few nonprofits that have been doing this work with us, a couple of new nonprofits that hadn't been doing this work with us, but they were limited resources, and unfortunately there's not additional resources at this time. If there are in the future, sometimes a funder will come to us and say, no, we want to support this kind of work. We will be sure to let you know and issue an RFP for that. Another note here, our community action is inviting League of Women Voters to help with community workshops. Great idea. I think that's it in terms of questions. So thank you very much, Courtney, for that presentation and for all the work that you're doing on Our Homes, Our Votes. All right, we will move on now to our next part of the agenda, and we have Susan Jacob, Program Director at Housing Counseling Services, Inc., who's going to talk about the work they've been doing under the umbrella of End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions project by NLIHC, the Erase project, and Susan will fill you in on their activities and hopefully answer a few questions as well. Susan?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. If I could get the slides. Thank you so much. So my name is Susan Jacob, and I am at Housing Counseling Services, a program director. I've been working in rental assistance and various homelessness prevention programs since 2009 here. And we're currently participating in the Erase program under the preventative cohort, which means that we are working to determine how to successfully divert evictions and prevent people from experiencing the eviction process through collaboration or exploring collaboration through various governmental organizations, the legal service providers, and courts, along with community-based organizations. Next slide, please. So just a little bit briefly about HCS. We're a nonprofit. We've been in the community in DC, the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area since 1972. And we work with clients to resolve and prevent all sorts of housing obstacles. Next slide. I am going to explain a little bit about eviction in DC, since I have found that it is a little bit different in DC versus other areas of the country. Eviction in DC is a formal legal process. You cannot be evicted in DC for many things, such as for example, if your landlord is selling your property and a new landlord is coming in, you don't have to actually leave that property. You can actually stay. The new owner becomes your landlord. And so that is one very specific example of how you don't have to leave your housing, even though your landlord might try to tell you that in DC. So in DC, you must receive a 30-day notice or have a court summons and trial. There needs to be a decision by a judge, and the eviction happens with the US Marshals, since our court process and our systems are all done by the federal court system. The landlord may not physically evict you or remove belongings. Next slide. And so I just went over very briefly some examples of why you could legally be evicted in DC. Non-payment of rent is the biggest one, and that's the one that we are working with at HCS in order to, under the preventative cohort, in order to try to really divert these evictions from happening and engaging landlords in the process of trying to prevent these evictions. Like I said, if there's a building sale or unpaid late fees or foreclosure, or if the landlord simply wants you to leave, that is not a reason to be evicted in DC. Next slide. So to bring it back to ERA 1 and ERA 2 funds, DC created the Stronger Together by Assisting You, or Stay DC program. And the program actually closed by the end of October, and we had expended basically all of the funds by the end of December. We were lucky enough to receive allocated funding. And so we were able to assist about 1,200 more households with the remaining funds and the remaining open applications. During the eviction moratorium, the program was very successful in assisting tenants in reducing the size of balances due, but it may not have paid off the full balances due to program restrictions, which is where a lot of our local funding came in. Next slide. So what we are trying to do under the preventative cohort, and with the assistance of many other partners, is we're trying to create an eviction diversion framework in DC. Right now, my agency, we participate in 2 working groups related to eviction diversion, one being a judicial working group, which is mainly a lot of the judges, legal service providers, and some community-based organizations. And then we also have another group that is a little bit more inclusive of other DC government organizations and other community-based organizations, where we meet on a weekly basis to discuss what this framework is going to look like. Also, part of this framework is having housing counselors present in the courtrooms. We have found that this has been instrumental in having the legal service providers, especially the attorneys for the housing providers and the judges, to have faith in the fact that we are actually working with these tenants to try and solve the delinquencies that are owed and pay down the balances, so the tenant can retain their housing, but the housing provider can also become whole in a balance that is due. We also have been having extensive collaboration amongst these groups of people for what we are calling our last mile payments. And what that means is in DC, as I'm sure is in other places, in order to avoid eviction, everything down to almost a penny has to be paid. And what we have noticed is that while the ERA funding through the Stay DC program absolutely assisted in bringing down these huge balances, somebody who may have received assistance back in February may still today be up for eviction and may need to have these last mile payments covered, maybe a last few $1,000s. And so what we have been doing is we've been collaborating with the legal service providers and the judicial system, as well as other community-based organizations, to then use our local funding to make up this difference. Next slide. So our outcomes, eviction started on September 13th. As soon as the moratorium was lifted, we had about 550 evictions scheduled between September and December. Of these, through this collaborative process, we have been able to stop about 70% of these evictions, given we had the ERA1 and ERA2 funding, as well as these last mile payments. We dispersed approximately $300 million in order to stop these evictions, and we would not have been able to do it without the collaboration between all these different entities. Additionally, we realized that housing case management is absolutely vital to this process. And so we have actually started a pilot program where we are providing housing case management in sort of a mediation process for people that are owing large balances that need to have negotiations with landlords, as well as going out into the community and going to different buildings and actually setting up what we are calling pop-up events, where we are able to bring case management to the community and allow for this collaboration and this mediation to happen on site. Next slide. Also, some of the outcomes that have happened are we've been successful in being able to pass legislation in DC, where if somebody had applied for state DC or what we call our local ERAP program, they could not be evicted as long as there was proof there was an application. Tenants who owe less than $600 now cannot be taken to court for eviction. Housing providers must be registered with our regulatory agency with all the proper information. Housing providers have to issue a 30-day notice to tenants prior to filing for eviction in court. And housing providers generally cannot use credit history as a reason to deny a voucher holder tenancy, which for us was huge. Next slide. Some of the challenges that we see: funding for the collaborative work. Obviously, funding is needed for counselors to be in court and for case management. Technology access for tenants to apply for rental assistance. Making sure these last mile payments, what we are calling last mile payments, are actually covering the eviction redemption amount. And making sure that housing providers are actually participating in this process, and that if we are making payments, they are definitely going to the housing provider. Next slide. And finally, our next steps are that we would like to complete this eviction diversion framework as a firm process. We want to make sure that housing counselors, as we've found them to be so vital, can definitely be present in court mediations to ensure payment plans and other housing stability challenges are addressed. And we also want to be able to maintain documentation barriers to be fairly low, but also ensure that funds are dispersed within regulations to ensure that limited funding reaches the most at-risk tenants. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was really a fantastic presentation, and what great work. And those outcomes were really phenomenal. So congratulations to you and the entire team there for all the work that you've been doing. There is a question here. I don't know if you're able to answer this. Are landlords able to evict tenants that aren't paying their portion of the Section 8 program? In other words, can those tenants receive emergency rental assistance for their 30% share?
Yeah, so landlords are able to start court actions against tenants that have not paid their share of their 30% share, but they are also able to access our local emergency rental assistance program, and they were also able to access the state DC program when it was available. So yes, they can be taken to court, but they also do have access to assistance.
Outstanding, outstanding. There's another question here. Do you make tenants in need of assistance go to housing counseling services case management?
Case management is never something that we force on anyone at all. It is a tool that we would like people to utilize, because what happens in case management in this pilot program that we have started, we pull someone's credit report with their permission. We work on a budget. We look at their full financial situation. We assess all their barriers that are leading towards housing instability, and we try to put together a very comprehensive plan to address those challenges, and in hopes and in an effort that we are diverting the household from a court action, as well as hoping that the household will then move towards stability and will hopefully not have to be in this situation again.
Fantastic. Well, Susan, I think that's it in terms of questions right now, particularly because of time, but I will just say a number of comments in the chat just saying fantastic, congrats, thank you, what a great presentation, and what a great work that you're doing. So thank you so much for coming on this call and sharing with us.
Thank you.
Okay, we will move on now to our first field update, and Jay Williams, a program associate from the Low Income Housing Coalition of Alabama, is here to present. Jay, take it away.
Hi, Paul. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you all today. I have a brief presentation about our advocacy toolkit. I work for the Low Income Housing Coalition of Alabama, where we advocate for affordable housing for the lowest income residents in the state, as well as for transforming Alabama's housing system. To do this, we engage in several platforms, but one of our primary products is our annual advocacy toolkit, which its purpose is to educate and empower and build the capacity for housing and homelessness advocates to do state level, community level advocacy for housing systems change. This was my first year in doing the advocacy toolkit, but we have done it every year since I think about 2012, when we advocated and were able to establish the Alabama Housing Trust Fund in the state. Our audience for our toolkit is our housing and homelessness service providers, as well as our cross systems and intersectional advocates, as well as new housing advocates in the state. But I'm going to share the toolkit in the chat so folks can check it out. We have every year we do updates to it, and this year we were able to add a couple of new items. One, it's a virtual meeting tool so that advocates can schedule meetings virtually with our legislators at the state level and at the federal level. And then we also added additional strategies for investment into the state housing trust fund. It was 2012 when the housing trust fund was established in Alabama, and since it has gone unfunded, we missed our opportunity to introduce a bill during our session, which actually just ended last week. However, there will be a special session this summer for the remaining American Rescue Plan Act dollars, and we are advocating for an investment of $25 million of American Rescue Plan Act dollars to the Housing Trust Fund so that we can get that program started. That's all I have for everybody, and I hope you all will check out the toolkit. Thanks so much.
Fantastic, Jay, and thanks for sharing that toolkit. The link, it sounds like it's a great resource. I love the virtual meeting tool, and trying to get significant resources into the State Housing Trust Fund. Really, really important work. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. I don't see any questions right now, but again, great work, and keep it up, and thank you for sharing. Okay, we will now move on to our next field update, and that is Mark Schwartz, Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing, I believe is in Illinois. Is that correct, Mark?
That's right, Chicago.
Yep. Okay, great. So take it away.
Well, thanks. So I've been asked to talk about the Chicago Right to Counsel pilots. Our advocacy on right to counsel is an outgrowth of our policy and court reform work, and it's very informed by our eviction data portal. So I'd like to start there. Next slide. LCBH launched a Chicago Evictions Data Portal as a resource to help policymakers and advocates investigate Chicago's chronic eviction problem using the eviction court data. We now have a decade's worth of data, which is a very good thing because On the other side of it, we're also very strong proponents of sealing the majority of evictions. The data portal has shown us that 40% of evictions result in dismissal. And then when you add those to the not for cause filings, all of these, in our opinion, should be sealed. Next slide, please. Our data looks a lot like what others are producing around the country. Still, I do think that local data is important for informing policy work. Before the portal in Chicago, we couldn't map eviction filings because addresses aren't included in the electronic docket. And so, even though everybody sort of has a sense of what's going on in eviction court and the disparate impact of people of color in eviction court, there wasn't really any way to determine where the evictions were being placed outside in the community. Now, policy and advocacy makers can click on our maps and they can see exactly what's going on in their wards and their communities. Next slide, please. So our map of Chicago looks a lot like other Chicago maps that show disparities because of Chicago's legacy of housing segregation. Still, our ability to break the eviction data down, again, to community area helps us with connecting with and empowering community-based organizers. Our ability to break the data down by ward helps us engage aldermanic offices. And people are very surprised when they see exactly what's going on in their communities. Next slide, please. Racial disparities in filing rates are jarring and getting worse. And again, it's the same as everywhere else in the country. This is just one local iteration of it. But we, in our most recent data poll, we've been, we update the data portal. We can't anymore because of there's a blanket eviction ceiling that just sunset. I'll get into that in a minute. But we haven't been able to update the portal in a couple of years because the eviction data isn't available. But the last time we updated it, it showed that majority Black areas have eviction filing rates even higher than they were when the first time we pulled it. So majority Black areas have filing rates 5 times as high as majority white areas overall. Some of them have filing rates 8 times as high. Whereas majority Latinx areas are twice as high as majority white areas. Next slide, please. Another finding is that almost 2/3 of eviction cases claiming back rent were filed for less than $2,500. This was an important marker for us because that was the upper limit on our emergency rental assistance funds that the state homeless prevention program would provide per family in Chicago. And so using this data was allowed us to successfully argue for a court-based rental assistance program in the courthouse. This was all pre-pandemic. Next slide, please. Chicago's representation rates are likewise very similar to the national rates. Next slide, please. One set of findings that I think are unique to our data is that we break out eviction outcomes by legal aid attorneys. The data show that we have that having an attorney significantly reduces the chances that a tenant will receive an eviction order, but not by very much. Overall, tenants reduced their likelihood of receiving an eviction by about 25% when they had an attorney. But that's without looking at the legal aid attorneys. With a private attorney, a Chicago tenant's likelihood of getting an eviction was about 52%. So that's a little less than the 60% overall. But with a legal aid attorney, it drops down to 28%. And this has certainly informed how we look at designing a right to counsel program in Chicago. And what we're working with right now is a coalition of legal aid providers. Next slide, please. So this is the last substantive slide. A lot has happened since the pandemic, but I want to highlight that none of these developments enumerated here were born out of COVID. They've been in the works for some time as we've moved towards right to counsel. And in fact, were derailed for a time because of COVID. Some of the changes in law should disincentivize eviction filings. Others will reduce the barriers advocates face when representing renters so that we can bring more eviction cases to a just conclusion. And I want to go through these real quick, just in case you're interested in any of them. And if you want to discuss more offline with me, if any of these make sense to your jurisdiction, I'd love to talk to any of you. So the first is the Chicago Fair Notice Ordinance. Chicago advocates have been able to push for a lot of things. We're still working on just good cause, but I believe this ordinance grew out of the conversations for just good cause. It was sort of the consolation prize. And what it does is it extends the non-renewal notice period from 30 days to 60 days for renters who've lived in their units for 6 months or more. And it extends it to 120 days for renters who've lived in the apartment for more than 3 years. But most significantly, this fair notice ordinance allows tenants to cure up to the entry of the eviction judgment. And so for many of you, you're working in jurisdictions where after the notice period expires to cure or quit, that's it. And it was the same in Chicago. So once we as legal aid would get a hold of a case, it was way after the 5-day notice period had expired. And now this allows renters to actually benefit from all the emergency rental assistance money that's out there right now. The Illinois Supreme Court issued a new procedural rule that requires that the demand for possession and notice of termination be attached to the complaint. Prior to that, in Illinois, there's no requirement that there be any allegations of exactly what the tenant is being alleged to have done to breach the lease. And the 10-day notice or 5-day notice or 30-day or whatever notice wasn't required to be attached. So legal aid attorneys were going in blind without knowing the specifics of the landlord allegations, and then getting discovery or getting the landlord to agree to show us these notices, let alone just for us to be able to determine when these notices were actually served, really put us at a great disadvantage. And it also just made, the process so much less transparent. So this rule should be very helpful as we move towards right to counsel, because now everything will be part of the court record, so that we as legal aid attorneys will have access to this as we determine our strategy in the case. The ceiling, as we continue to level the playing field in eviction court, it's critical that tenants aren't penalized for filings that don't end in a judgment or for no fault filings. Some of our ideas for an eviction ceiling curtain that would happen at the beginning of a case, so that tenants weren't, so that it wasn't, an eviction filing wasn't in the record, and then it would be opened up maybe if it was determined that the tenant had a judgment of some sort. These ideas were adopted in this emergency COVID bill that has sealed all evictions for the last 2 years during the pandemic period, and also has lowered the standard for tenants to go in and move for having their records sealed in older cases. But all of this is sunsetting. So the 2-year pandemic sealing curtain has sunset, and the ability for tenants to be able to move for their record to be sealed at this lower standard is going to sunset at the end of July. So we're really in clinic mode right now, trying to have as many clinics as we can to help people file these motions. And we do need to we need to get this permanent now, because right now it's back to the way it was before, where a tenant really has to show that there was no basis in fact or law for the sealing. So I want to, in closing, I want to just say that Chicago is now very close to joining the civilized world in right to counsel. I should note, though, that the right to counsel pilot that we're taking on, we got a 3-year right to counsel pilot grant for $7.1 million, is not technically right to counsel because there's no legislation enshrining the right. It's very aspirational, but we have some really good partners. When the moratorium ended, we began working with the Chicago Bar Foundation and the Eviction Court on an early resolution program. And this was one of the legal developments that was truly born out of COVID. Instead of eviction cases being set for trial on the first time up, they're now set for a status, and tenants are directed to legal aid attorneys for brief legal advice and to rental assistance screeners. And the partners are going to use this ERP program to screen tenants in court directly into the right to counsel program. 2 of our partners in the early resolution program are also working on the right to counsel program. Carpels and their helpline, for those of you who know Chicago and Cook County, will help screen prospective tenants, and Legal Aid Chicago will join LCPH to take on the full representation cases. And finally, the Polk Foundation is committed to funding Stout, the people that did the cost benefit analyses in New York and all these other jurisdictions to perform a cost benefit analysis for the Chicago region so that we can make arguments for legislation here. And so thanks for having me come on, and this is my contact information.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. What great work that the Chicago Eviction Data Portal is just phenomenal. The maps that you showed, the racial disparities that you shared with us. I mean, it's just so disgraceful and not surprising, unfortunately. So there is a question here. If an eviction is sealed, is it still able to be filed as an alias claim in the future so renters do not have to pay court costs for new filings?
Oh, that's I mean, if it's I don't think that I mean, I don't see how if it's sealed and over, that's the end of the case. I mean, there are I know that in some places there are a lot of serial filings of eviction. In Chicago, the cost for a plaintiff to file an eviction is significant enough that we don't see that many serial filings. But if there were serial filings, I think that if the tenant couldn't afford, there's, they're able to get a fee waiver.
Okay, great. There's just a recommendation here that you need to check out Washington State's legislation that's passed. But just want to wish you the very, very best in this endeavor, Mark. Great presentation and phenomenal work that you're carrying out there. Thank you so much for sharing it on today's call. Okay, I want to move on to just a couple of things. Actually, we got in our Q&A, we got a message from somebody who is describing her own and her daughter's challenges with their housing. I do want to just share that the National Low Income Housing Coalition does not provide direct assistance. We're an advocacy organization trying to get Congress to do the right thing and to invest and pass policies that will help people like the individual who shared that circumstances she was dealing with. We will, however, have somebody on the NLIC team reach back out to you and just tell you where you might go to find the assistance that could be helpful to you. I didn't want to ignore it, and I just wanted to mention that as an advocacy organization, we don't provide the kind of assistance that you're seeking, but we do have some places that you can call, some websites that you can look at that might be able to provide you some assistance. So I just wanted to share that. And I just wanted to remind everybody several to-dos in terms of follow-ups on this call. Please reach out to your members of Congress about the FY23 budget and urge the highest level of funding possible for affordable housing programs, particularly our 5 priorities we shared at the very beginning of this call. Reach out to them about the key components of the reconciliation bill as negotiations begin to take place again on that. And then we really do invite all of you to join us for next Monday's webinar on our homes, our votes, nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement, and how you as advocates and nonprofits around the country can do that appropriately in a nonpartisan way. And that, yes, nonprofits can be involved in voter registration, voter mobilization, and candidate engagement as well. And we'll show you how to do that through this series of webinars. So please join us for that. And thank you to all of our panelists. They were all fantastic today. And thank you all for participating in today's call. All of those of you who just called in to listen in, thank you so much. And we'll do another one of these calls in 2 weeks. So join us for that. Take care, everybody, and have a great week.